Okay, thank you. So the slides have shifted a little, but I'm Nicole Sparapani. As Robin said, I am an assistant professor in the School of Education, also a faculty member at the Mind Institute, and I practice as a speech-language pathologist on an interdisciplinary team serving students, preschool students with autism for several years. And the story that I always kind of like to start off with is the reason why I went from being a speech-language pathologist in a clinical setting or school setting into research. So as I was practicing as a speech-language pathologist, we were working really, really hard. I had a fantastic interdisciplinary team, and we saw change in our students over time, over the course of the school year. We were really specializing in individualizing their programs and promoting active engagement. And year after year, any student that walked through the door, we saw a lot of progress. Well, unfortunately, what we also observed for about 6 years, I observed as the students went from our preschool setting into a elementary school setting, they weren't able to exhibit those gains. They weren't showing that they had gained the things that we saw that they gained. And so after, like I said, about 6 years of watching this, I decided that I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to learn about what active engagement was in the classroom context, general and special education, elementary school context. And so I kind of pushed my clinical hat aside for a little bit and went back to school at Florida State University, where I had an opportunity to work with an amazing research team. Amy Weatherby was my mentor, and now I had the chance to study what active engagement looked like. So that is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, primarily focusing on preschool through second grade students. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge the people in my life that has made this possible. My research colleagues, mentors, the students and research teams that I've worked with, in addition to the families and teachers and students that have made all of this possible. As an outline, what we're going to talk about today is, I'm going to briefly talk about my approach or my framework to both research and clinical practice. And then I want to talk about what active engagement is, what I'm referring to when I'm talking about active engagement. I'll go through about 3 studies to illustrate this. And then I want to give you guys specific strategies to promote active engagement in the classroom environment. And then finally, we'll talk about putting all of this together. So what would this look like in a general education classroom? Okay, so to start, Autism Spectrum Disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder that currently affects 1 in 68 children in the United States. It's characterized by impairment in social communication and the presence of restricted interest and repetitive behaviors. It is currently, 68% of students are currently, 68% of students that have autism currently do not meet the criteria for having intellectual disability. So what that means is that more and more students are accessing general education curricula and classrooms. But we see in autism this kind of heterogeneous profiles or varying profiles of skills. So this is causing a great need for teachers or educators to be able to really understand how to promote active engagement in the classroom when their students with autism vary so much. Current literature has suggested that teachers are feeling unprepared when it comes to promoting or programming for kids on the autism spectrum. One thing I want to point out before I move on, I forgot to do this originally, all of the students that I have in these pictures have been my students across the year. So this little guy is probably 6 or 7 here. He was in my preschool program, started at 3.5, and I just recently got to see him. He just turned 18. So as I'm looking at these, if you see me smile, it's because the students in my presentation have really driven my kind of passion for for the past 16 years maybe. Okay, so my approach to research and clinical practice is really grounded in this dynamic systems theories, where we are considering not only the student, but we're also considering the environment. So that means that students walk into classrooms with kind of a set of characteristics. And as I mentioned, students with autism have kind of varying profiles of characteristics. And so we might see, a varying degree to regulate their behavior and emotions, varying degree of ability to socially communicate with others, language, the ability or capacity to regulate their attention. So they have kind of this set of characteristics that they are bringing into the classroom environment. But then on the flip side, we want to also think about what the classroom environment has. So every classroom environment is a little bit different. And when we're looking at specific characteristics in that classroom environment, like the amount of language or the specific types of activities, or what the classroom organization or classroom climate looks like, those things are also influencing the student, right? So it's not just one, it's both kind of working together reciprocally. So as an example, consider this student, Tommy, in Mrs. B's class. So again, Tommy comes with kind of a set of characteristics, developmental skills. His language is fairly, say, above average. He's very expressive. So the teacher sometimes thinks he's too expressive. His receptive language is not as strong, so he sometimes has a hard time following routines, understanding the classroom expectations. He has some difficulty regulating his behaviors and emotions. He is fairly social. He likes his peers, and he tends to imitate his peers quite often. So he actually does really well in Mrs. B's class. Mrs. B has a very organized, structured classroom environment. The students know what they're supposed to be doing. Materials, everybody has access to materials. Now, consider Tommy in Mrs. H's class. Excuse me. So Tommy brings the same set of characteristics into the classroom, but now think about the classroom environment. So in Mrs. H class, it's very chaotic. There's not a lot of structure and organization. There's a lot of yelling. And think about his peer models in this classroom. So we're not necessarily seeing the same gains and same progress in social or academic goals that Tommy is exhibiting in Mrs. B's class. So again, this is just an example to show that not only do we want to be considering and thinking about the individual influences that students with autism are bringing into the classroom, but we really want to focus too on what the classroom context, how that is influencing student development over time. So I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk to you about what classroom active engagement is. So in the literature, this is just defined very broadly about the interaction between the student's observable behavior in response to whatever's happening in the classroom environment. It's typically measured through on-task classroom behaviors. So an example would be during a literacy block, students would be reading and writing. So the students that are actually reading and writing would be considered to be exhibiting on-task behaviors and be active engaged. But this definition actually might be too broad for individuals on the autism spectrum. It might not necessarily kind of capture what, how actively engaged a student is, because there might be specific components that are hindering the ability to actively engage in students with autism. So for example, we frequently see that students with autism have some challenges or have a difficulty regulating their emotions and behavior. So I've been calling this emotional regulation, the ability to maintain the physiological arousal to actually participate in an activity. This is quite challenging for many individuals on the autism spectrum, and something that I'll talk about throughout the presentation. We know that joint attention is a core deficit in individuals with autism. So in the classroom, it might be difficult for students with autism to actually be attending to the relevant instruction or attending to materials or others. We know that core deficit is social communication. So being able to really understand and use language in a manner that is efficient might be difficult for students with autism in the classroom. And again, what that could be doing is kind of jeopardizing this ability to get the most out of discussions and interactions in the classroom. It also might hinder the ability to really understand classroom expectations or to follow the directions if they're not specifically given. And then finally, with core deficits in the area or the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviors, we often see that many individuals with autism have a hard time kind of moving with the flow of the classroom. So small changes in the environment might really cause kind of big reactions. And it's also we also might see kind of a hesitation to participate in new activities for individuals that are really focused on a certain area of interest. So the core and associated features that we see in kids with autism may be kind of hindering their ability to actively participate in the activity. However, we know that active engagement is something that's been considered very important for learning in kids with autism. It's considered a key component for effective programs, and the National Research Council has recommended that students with autism at a minimum are actively engaged 25 hours per week to promote positive outcomes in social and academic. But again, thinking about active engagement, this is a very dynamic construct when we're thinking about it in all kids, but specifically in kids with autism, and it hasn't been well defined, and there is a limited amount of research that's been done around observing active engagement in kids with autism. So as part of my my doctoral studies, I had the opportunity to work with Amy Weatherby and the team at Florida State to be able to evaluate active engagement in a large group of individuals in kindergarten through second grade. The study that we were working on was called the Classroom Search Intervention Project. So we observed active engagement in 196 students with autism across 126 classrooms, and again, kindergarten through second grade students, across several schools in Florida and in San Diego, California. About 45% were in general education, so we had almost half in special education classrooms and half in general education classrooms. And we collected, as part of the larger study, video observations. So we had a trained videographer going into the classroom and videotaping kids doing classroom activities for about 60 minutes. And we did this across the school year, but I'm going to be talking about the beginning of the school year. Those video observations ranged from observing kids during transitions, the literacy block when they were when they'd go out to recess, during meals and snacks, other academics such as math, during arts and crafts. So we had kind of a large array of different activities that we were observing. And we worked together to develop this measure of active engagement. So it's called the CMA, the Classroom Measure of Active Engagement. Really, it's an observational research tool that we were trying to address the core learning challenges that we see in students with autism. And so it provides almost a measure of performance, a measure of active engagement across these different learning activities with a hope to be able to not only quantify this, but to be able to see change in time. And so I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail, but we came up with 9 different behaviors that we actually wanted to observe in these students. And these were the components that we were thinking were the most important components that comprised active engagement. The first one is emotional regulation. So again, this kind of ability to be able to monitor and effectively, that's a key word, effectively manage physiological arousal, behavior, emotional states to be able to cope with the demands in the classroom. And as you can see here, this is a good example of a student being well-regulated. This is my nephew and a little friend. They're in the library together. His body is ready. He's listening. He's in a well-regulated state here. The next dimension is classroom participation, which consisted of productivity and independence. So with this, we were looking at these videos and coding times when students were what we called productive. They were performing meaningful roles and jobs, which really could be anything from carrying their own materials to writing in the classroom. I don't have classroom examples, but some of my outside community examples are, thinking about going blueberry picking. This little guy is holding the bucket. He's picking his own blueberries. So this idea of being able to kind of be involved in physically or motorically doing something. And then with independence, we coded times that they were not only productive, but that they were independent. So they weren't getting assistance from another person. And again, I like to point out this picture. This was a little family that I used to work with, and I would kind of send parents away, and then I would put them to work. But again, the amount of learning that was happening here with just being involved, having productive roles and doing things on their own was really impressive, even if it's laundry. So then the next one is social connectedness. So we coded each time that the students responded. And that could be a physical response or some kind of verbal response, and it did not have to indicate whether they really understood what was being asked. So, for example, if the teacher said, go put your paper in the backpack, and the student went and put his paper, threw it out the door, we still coded responding because he did respond to that verbal bid. And then we actually coded every single instance of eye gaze that we recorded in these videos. So every time the student would look up at a peer or a teacher at their face, we coded eye gaze to face. Initiating communication, there's only a couple more, there are 9 total. So we coded each instance that the students directed communication. The communication could be any vocalization, verbalization, or gesture. But the key was that it had to be directed and it had to serve some kind of purpose. And then generative language, we coded the times that students used kind of a creative language. So it's not rote or practiced, it was something that they were generating. And then finally, with flexibility, we coded instances where there were opportunities for the student to shift and whether they were willing to shift. So for example, if it was time to clean up one activity and go to the next, we considered that an opportunity to change, and then we coded the student's response to that. And then finally, with flexible attention, we coded the times when students were asked to shift their attention. So if they were looking at something and somebody called their name, could they then shift from one thing to the next? As I'm telling you, we coded this. We coded a 15-minute sample of that entire hour. So we systematically picked different activities to code. We had really good reliability across our coders. And what we found overall was that students were not that actively engaged in classroom activities as a whole. So again, 196 students across general and special education classrooms. About less than half of the time they were spending in this well-regulated state. Again, this kind of ability to manage your behavior, to participate in a classroom activity. Less than half of the time they were productive. And again, remember, we define that as kind of just doing anything. So we're seeing that about half the time, or less than half the time. And then about a quarter of the time we saw independence in the classroom. So we saw a lot of teachers and others kind of doing things with or for students. In terms of responding, we saw that students responded about half of the time. So whenever there was language or verbal bid that went out, we saw about half of the time, on average, they responded. But we did see a lot of variability with this. So some students tended to respond to almost everything, and others didn't respond very often. And then with flexible behavior and attention, we saw a little bit more. So we saw more willing to kind of participate in the activity and shifting at about 50% of the time. And then finally, when we're thinking about our social communication codes, so the use of eye gaze, we saw on average about 11 times that they were actually looking at the people in their classrooms, and directing communication about 7 times. Generative language was about 5 within this 15-minute block. So overall, we said overall students just aren't exhibiting that much active engagement in classroom activities. So what this study did was just kind of provide some preliminary support for our active engagement measure, our CMA, as a promising tool that we could use across time and look to see if these behaviors are changing in kids with autism. It also highlights the challenges that we see in individuals with autism. So it gives us a lot more information than just saying they're on task or not or off task. It actually shows us different areas that they're on or off task. So next we were interested in thinking about that variability that we saw. So we saw, again, some kids were looking a lot more than others. We saw this variability kind of across the sample. So we wanted to see if our 196 students were really just one whole group, or if we can use that measure of active engagement to think about different profiles or subgroups in the individuals with autism. And so we did a profile analysis and actually found that our 196 students fell pretty nicely into these 4 different categories or 4 different profiles or subgroups. So in more detail, we found that in profile 1, that consisted of the majority of the group. So out of 196 students, we saw 126 students falling in this profile. This profile was characterized by kind of overall below active engagement. So, all of our components, productivity, eye gaze, directed communication, generative language, and responding all fell below the average of the sample. For profile 2, this was about 12% of the sample. We saw that this was characterized by kind of more eye gaze, so a strengthened eye gaze relative to all of the other active engagement components. So these kiddos were kind of looking, but not really doing much else in classroom activities. In profile 3, this was about 17% of the sample, and it was characterized by kind of relative strength in generative language compared to the other areas. And then finally, in profile 4, which was our smallest profile, we saw kind of overall more active engagement compared to the rest of the sample. So more overall, more productivity in eye gaze, more directed communication. So again, this is kind of a really interesting work. It shows that we actually can identify specific patterns when we use this classroom measure of active engagement that can really provide more information about what students are doing in classroom activities. And this possibly can kind of guide specific types of interventions or intervention strategies that we would consider. So finally, the last study that I'm going to present to you about active engagement is I was really curious in looking at the language environment. So this was actually my dissertation at Florida State University. So after watching these videos kind of over and over and over again, to code all of the active engagement things, the one thing that I kept coming back to was the language. So in some classrooms, there was so much language. If a student was sitting in a general education classroom, often they had a teacher assistant, and so they were getting language kind of from the general education teacher, also from the assistant. Sometimes the students around were also, talking, so there was a lot of language. And then in other classrooms, students may have been, not exhibiting as much. So I was really curious about the language environment and how this actually might influence or relate to student active engagement. And then I was interested to look at if there were differences in the language environment across general education and special education classrooms. Just briefly, we know that teacher language is important. There's been quite a lot of research to suggest this, that high quality language such as teachers' use of open-ended questions, making comments, has been associated with student active engagement in typically developing students in general education classrooms. In special education classrooms, there's been work that has suggested that there's a link between what teachers are saying and what students are saying. So more open-ended questions and comments has been associated with more initiations and responses in individuals that have disabilities, not specifically individuals with autism. And so again, using that same sample of 196 students, this time we were interested in looking at the teachers. So we had 71 teachers in general education classrooms and 55 teachers in special education classrooms. And we coded that 15-minute observation across 7 different categories of teacher language. So again, listening to all of the language that the teachers were delivering that was expectant language. So they were expecting to, expectant language, period. So comments, we define this as contextual statements, making statements about what the student is doing or something that they're experiencing in the environment. Open-ended questions, so questions that really can elicit any kind of response, not just a fixed response. Language models, so not necessarily wanting the student to respond, but providing language for students to see what was going on. Demands or commands would be directing the student's behavior in some way. So that would be, go get your book. Close-ended questions are questions that were used to elicit a specific response. So a good example would be if they were reading a book together and the teacher said, what is this child doing? And the child is running. And so the answer to that question is running. Indirect requests we saw quite often. So we're so polite when we talk. We talk in these kind of indirect requests a lot of times. So can you go shut the door? Can you go get your book? So we coded this because we were seeing that kids were answering it. No. Sometimes they said yes, but sometimes they said yes and they didn't do it. So that is, again, kind of an indirect request. The teacher's actually saying, go get your book. And then finally, fill-ins is really common. We saw this a lot in kindergarten through second grade classrooms where the teacher says something and then kind of stops and the students fill in the blank. So overall, what we found was that there was a lot more language that special education teachers were using as a whole than general education teachers. So we saw more language in special education environments. And then we also saw more language that was specifically directed at the student. So we had coded whether the expectant language was to the group of students, where the teacher would say, everybody, what is this? Versus times when the teacher would say, Johnny, what is this? So we were seeing a lot more individual language directed at students in special education classrooms. So as a whole, we saw more close-ended questions and demands than any other language category. This is actually consistent with what the literature is saying now, that although we have some evidence saying that those kind of open-ended questions and use of comments are higher quality, we typically see more close-ended questions in the classroom. And then in special education classrooms, we saw more demands, so more directing the student's behavior. And so how does this relate to student active engagement? That was the next part of this. In general education classrooms, the use of open-ended questions, closed-ended questions, fill-ins, and comments and language models were associated with students initiating more. So more directed communication, more generative language overall. In general education classrooms, we also saw this connection between the language that teachers used and students' intellectual functioning or intellectual abilities. So the teachers tended to use less language with students that had less cognitive capacity. But in special education classrooms, we saw something different. And again, this goes back to the original question I was so interested in is, are these environments, the structure of the language environment, is is it the same? And it turns out that it's not. So in special education classrooms, overall, we just saw, again, more language. But interestingly, this increase of language was related to this increase of dysregulation, or this decrease of being in that well-regulated state. So we saw kind of more language, again, associated with kids tending to be less well-regulated. We also saw the use of open-ended questions, comments, and language models associated with less responding and less eye gaze. And what we thought, kind of what we concluded with this is that it might not necessarily be that these categories of language are not kind of rich sources for students with autism in special education classrooms. It might be that the overall amount of language is kind of just jeopardizing students' kind of ability to respond, or intensifying the challenges that learners with autism are facing in that school setting. And so just kind of final thoughts related to this story is that, this study is at the beginning of something. All the research so far that I have done have just kind of opened up this door to a lot of questions. And so in this study, this provides some tangible characteristics of the language environment that we can think about, possibly supporting or hindering students' ability to actively engage. Okay, so this is the more fun part. So I wanted to kind of lay out all the definitions, but now I really want to talk to you about how to promote, so specific strategies on how to promote active engagement in the classroom environment. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on supporting emotional regulation. If you are my colleague, you've heard all of this, and I apologize. But this is something that I think is extremely important when we are thinking about kids in educational settings. So again, as I mentioned before, emotional regulation, the way that we've conceptualized it here, is really this ability to kind of match your physiological arousal and your behaviors to meet the demands of an activity. And so this visual kind of gives an example of what this means. So on a scale from 1 to 10, this kind of perfect 5 range would be a student that does this really well and that is able to be in a well-regulated state during activities. So in the classroom environment, this would be like during a reading lesson that the student is sitting upright, rather than jumping around in their chair or sleeping, which would be a 1. Is alert, is calm, is quiet, is eager enough to, and ready to go. So there's a little bit of a range. Again, this kind of 4, 5, and 6 is this optimal range for, you have your learner, the student is ready to go. Dysregulation would be, anything that's falling above or below, so kind of a 7 and up, or a 3 and down. And dysregulation has been thought of, kind of interfering with a student's ability to be in that good learning place, right? So when I'm working with others, I always say, do you have your learner? And if your child that you're working with is sleeping, then the answer would be no. They are exhibiting pretty extreme dysregulation. They are not in that optimal place for learning. So the interesting thing is, after observing students with autism for several years, working with teams of professionals, and working with kids with autism, we rarely see in classrooms that kids are just kind of sitting and ready to go. We actually do see a lot of this kind of bouncing around, sometimes falling on the ground, so we see kind of this range of different observable behaviors that students are doing. And so over the past couple of years, I've been really interested in further understanding this. So currently, in collaboration with Emily Solari, we are trying to pick this apart. So the question is, are there specific behaviors that students are exhibiting that aren't signs of dysregulation, but are maybe signs of self-regulation? So there might be things that students are doing in classroom environments that are helping them to stay actively engaged. An example would be kind of rocking back and forth or swaying, hand flapping, using self-talk. So maybe when we see specific signs of observable behavior in the classroom, the student is self-regulating their behavior to be able to hang in there. But there also might be specific behaviors that can indicate dysregulation, whether that's mild or extreme. So, maybe jumping up and down is a sign of dysregulation, but gently rocking is not. Running out the door is a sign of extreme dysregulation. If you think about the numbers, that would be, a 10. You've lost your learner. And so we know in students with autism that they do typically overreact or underreact to the environmental stimuli. So in working with kiddos over the years, sometimes it just takes a little bit of something. Like one little guy I was working with loved music. You turn on music and all of a sudden he's going from his kind of perfect 5 zone up to a 7 or an 8, where he's rocking and he's singing and he's really, really jazzed. So kind of the little bit of input, just giving that little bit of music really caused a big kind of reaction. So again, the overall question is there observable behaviors that we can see that actually could be helping students to self-regulate? And so again, in collaboration with Emily Solari at the RAD Center, we just recently started to pick this apart. So as part of a pilot intervention for a pilot reading intervention, we observed videos, again, of 20 children, a little bit older this time, across these sessions that averaged about 40 minutes. And we were coding specifically signs, mild, and extreme dysregulation. And so interestingly, what we found was that the majority of the time, these students were exhibiting signs of dysregulation that were not interfering with their ability to participate. So out of a 40-minute session, about 23 minutes, we saw students kind of exhibiting some kind of observable behavior that didn't seem to interfere with their ability to participate. We saw very, very little time where they actually were in that kind of optimal perfect 5, where they were just sitting. So some examples. In one of the videos, there was a little boy that was rocking back and forth, and he wasn't in a rocking chair, so this was in an intervention, and he was in a chair like you guys are sitting in now. And so it was a little awkward because it didn't rock very well, but that rocking seemed maybe to be helping him. He was oriented to the teacher, he was answering questions, he seemed to be participating in the activity. The next one is another little guy that if I had to put a number on him, I would have said he's probably at a 7 to a 7 and an 8. He was standing up. He was really jazzed about the content. He got very excited about certain vocabulary words that they were working on, but he just didn't stop moving. So he's in this, he was in his session and he was just kind of going back and forth. But the other thing was that there was, again, that oriented. He was oriented to the materials, he was oriented to the teacher, and he was initiating a lot of communication, a lot of comments, a lot of questions. It was really exciting to see. And then finally, the last one was a little girl that was chewing on her shirt and kind of really rubbing at her eyebrow. She was, though, also leaning forward, listening to a story that was being read to her as part of the intervention. And she was asking the most complex generative questions that I had heard across the intervention. So in sum, are there specific behaviors that students are exhibiting that are serving to self-regulate? They're serving the function of self-regulating. And if that's the case, then maybe it's okay if we let them do that, right? If they are appropriate and they seem to be effectively keeping them engaged, keeping them on topic. So again, when gently rocking in a chair, holding a fidget toy, maybe there are things that students with autism are exhibiting that look a little different, but are serving a positive function. However, we did see that there are times when students did exhibit mild to extreme dysregulation. And, this is, again, something that I've been really focused on over the past several years, is when students are feeling dysregulated, in the classroom environment, this is a sign for us as professionals to know that and to respect that something's going on. There is some mild to extreme dysregulation. And so rather than kind of increase demands, we've always tried to decrease demands when we recognize that students are feeling mild to extreme dysregulated. These are also strategies from over the years and in my classroom that we put in place. So not only do we want as professionals to kind of observe these behaviors and give us some information about what students are experiencing, but we also want to start to teach them about their bodies and their ability to regulate their emotions. So right from the very beginning in preschool classrooms, we've started putting in that number system. So really teaching the students how to identify where they are, know when they are in a place where they might be using some regulatory strategies to hang in there, but also knowing when they need to go and take a break or they need to step away. And then giving them strategies of how to kind of come down. So again, thinking of my numbers, it would be if a student is at a 10, coming back down to a 6 or a 7 where they're available for learning again. So next, the use of visual strategies. Many of you probably already do this, but I think this is just really important. Language is not always a strength, especially thinking about receptive language or the understanding of words. So sometimes just the simple task of putting something visual in front of them, in front of students, it causes an increase in self-regulation or an increase in being well-regulated and a decrease of stress. And again, it's amazing how a visual schedule or adding in what I used to call a first-then board, so first you're doing this and then you're doing this as a visual would kind of relieve any kind of problematic behavior. Visuals also provide predictability and clarity, and they can be as constant reminders for those students that are constantly asking, excuse me, what's coming up next. So some examples of visual supports that can be used in the classroom are, again, visual schedules, and this could be a whole visual schedule or a visual schedule that's specifically for a student. I was working with, I've worked with teachers in the past where we have talked about, okay, maybe the student is following the whole class schedule, but maybe just putting something specific on their desk is enough to be able to get that student to know the sequence of the daily events. We've worked together to kind of outline rules of things, using choice boards, transitional systems, so whenever there's some kind of transition happening, it's all kind of visually mapped out. Steps of an activity are broken down. So again, visuals are just increasing clarity and understanding. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they feel like magic. I used to, when I was practicing in my preschool classroom, I just used to carry around a notepad and a pencil of some sort. And I would just write things out. And again, a student that's saying, how many more are there? Just jotting down the numbers 1 through 5 and having them cross off, you've done 1 through 3, so there are 2 left, would just help them finish that activity. More examples of visuals from my classroom are, using a checklist. So again, the difference in what students needed varied. So we specialized or personalized their visuals based on what they needed. And so this student here on the left, he loved to read, and he loved everything to be written out in a checklist, and he felt really awesome and eager when he would get to say, hey, I finished that, and it would also give him the predictability of what was happening next. This next one is, a student that needed a lot less support, so we actually just had, there are 5 things going on in the next 3, I was going to say 3 hours, but 5 things going on in the next 30 minutes, and he would do one and then put it in all done. And then finally, the last schedule was for a little girl that she liked to erase. So every single morning, we had this on a piece of paper that we laminated. This was her schedule, and we could change it. She actually knew that it was something that wasn't the same every day, but she liked when she would finish something, she would erase it, and we'd move on. So individualized visual schedules. And then More examples of visual support. So again, kind of visually outlining everything. This is an example of outlining the steps to the activity. So a lot of times, in classrooms, I'll see that we've got really nice visuals in place, but this piece is missing. So when students go to a reading, their reading center or their reading block, they know it's time for reading. That's been visually structured, but they don't know how many things they're going to be doing in that time, or they don't know when it's going to be over. And so you typically at that point in time hear students requesting that predictability, seeking that predictability. So how many more do we have? When am I gonna be done? That kind of stuff. And so that's an indicator that students are actually just wanting you to write out the number of things that are gonna happen in that time period before it's over. And then for the next one, it's about creating meaningful jobs or roles. So again, we had coded this, we had studied this in our classroom measure of active engagement. This is something, again, that's so simple that we can put in place across home and school environments. And it's just about giving students meaningful roles or jobs. So this could be passing out paper, collecting materials, carrying their own materials, putting things away. I've worked with families before where we actually wrote lists of things around routine. So during the bath time routine, look at all these steps that the child can be doing on their own that are creating these opportunities to have a meaningful role in that activity. There is a little boy that I was consulting with at a school in Arizona, and during transitions in this classroom, it was a second grade classroom, the classroom was so chaotic. I want to say there was like over 30, maybe 35 students in this classroom, and he made a fun, predictable sequence out of the transition time. So when it was time to transition, the teacher would say, like, ring a bell or some sort, and he would start running around the room and jumping from one chair down onto the floor, crawling under a table, up onto another chair, crawling. So he was doing these kind of laps of an obstacle course, and that was kind of his predictable routine. So we worked together to just put on his schedule at that time that his job, his meaningful role, was to collect pencils. And we were trying to think about something that could keep him engaged for that amount of time, because the transitions lasted a little longer. But so on his schedule, it said, you are the pencil collector. Each day that we transition from this activity to this, you'll collect pencils. And then when you're done, he got to go somewhere. It was like going and getting some water or going to the library. And something, again, as simple as that worked really beautifully. Walking back in the next week, he was collecting pencils, and he took his job very, very seriously until he actually saw that there were like pieces of like pencils on the floor. Then we had to shift, because then he was really into wanting to collect all the small pieces of pencil. But it worked. So some other examples from my preschool classroom, again, just thinking about he's feeding himself. He has a spoon. He went and got it. He got his own napkin. He went and got all the materials to set up this activity and then did the painting by himself. With a little bit of support with holding the paper, same thing. He went and got the scissors and is doing the cutting. This is my lunch bunch from my preschool classroom. And if you look at the wild bunch, you can see that there's a lot of things that they are doing. So we had pitchers with just a tiny little bit of juice in them because the students were sharing and they were pouring their own juice. They got their own napkins. They threw out their own trash and so forth. And so finally, just briefly, the fourth strategy to promote active engagement in the classroom, and again, thinking about simple strategies, is to support communication. So really understanding that all behavior serves a function, whether it's verbal or nonverbal behavior, and that function can be to communicate a variety of different things. And so as practitioners and teachers and parents, we just need to be sensitive that, or be a detective, of like, what is the student saying, and what does it mean, even if the words that they're saying doesn't necessarily indicate that meaning. The other thing is that some students use words and other students might not. So really thinking about what is the best method for this student to be able to communicate wants and needs and participate in interactions. So just two examples here. Again, this is during a lunch bunch here. One of our students was using an assistive technology device, and it was a really neat time because everybody kind of got into, like, this thing is really cool, but he needed that device to be able to communicate his wants and needs. This is my little friend that I just got to see that just turned 18. He was a master at eye gaze and pointing, and he was a master at anything visual. And so we made this very, very detailed communication book where he would just point, and we were actually working on sequencing together larger utterances and also using it for functional communication. And so finally, look at my time here, the last thing I wanted to do was thinking about putting all of this information together. And so this really comes from the transition of studying and specializing in students with autism for several years, at Florida State and before in the classroom. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and think about the classroom instead of the students with autism, right, and what students need. So for my postdoc studies, I actually worked with somebody named Carol Connor at Arizona State who specialized in classroom research. And so my thinking was, okay, we have a lot of information on what students with autism need to benefit or to be successful. So specific strategies, there's a lot of intervention, and again, that's great. But I was more curious to further understand what it was about high-quality classrooms that could support active engagement already. So what things were already in place instead of adding something new. So I went and did my postdoc at Arizona State with Carol Connor because she was doing just that. She was studying something called individualized student instruction. So in the general education classroom, students are individuals, and how can teachers best kind of plan their day to support their needs? So for 3 years, this is what I was involved in. An example just to get started is considering this student number 1. So this is a first grader in Mr. L's classroom. She has some difficulty regulating her physiological arousal and behaviors. She has a hard time staying on task. She has limited language and social communication skills and some difficulty with reading and writing. So again, this is student number 1. And here's another student in Mr. L's class. So same classroom, but a completely different profile. So this student actually has really strong language and reading skills, good social communication. He or she effectively uses self-regulation strategies. She can, the teacher gives her a task and she can carry out the task with minimal support. And she exhibits some inflexibility. So she's not really happy when it's time to transition from one thing to the next. She has some resistance to change. So the idea here is that, here are 2 students that really present with different profiles in the same classroom. So what is one teacher, supposed to do with supporting the needs of both of these students? And so the answer is simple, except for it's not all that simple. But the idea is that one size doesn't fit all. So again, this is all under this framework of, individualizing student instruction means that you have to consider the specific characteristics that students are bringing into the classroom, but you also have to consider that they might need something different because they are all bringing in different things. And so the idea is to be able to create kind of optimal learning opportunities for each of these students across every school day. So this goes into pretty good detail around how to further support, literacy learning and how to individualize literacy instruction. But what I got kind of caught up on over the 3 years of working with Carol Connor and her research team was that the foundation of teachers being able to individualize student instruction was about beginning with a strong classroom organization. So this meant that The classroom didn't look like Mrs. H's classroom, the picture I showed you in the beginning of the session. It looked like Mrs. B's classroom, where everything kind of had a place. Materials were in designated areas. Desks were arranged in a way where students weren't tripping on things. Backpacks and all materials kind of had a place. Well-organized classrooms kind of run themselves. So they become kind of this systematic machine. The classroom is just running itself because there is so much structure and predictability. So students are independent, and they have practiced the routines and the procedures so many times that they know exactly what to do. They don't need a lot of assistance. And so again, this is thinking about general education classrooms, right? And what does it take to be able to individualize? So the other thing that I thought was very interesting was that in this framework, we worked a lot with teachers around thinking about what the students are doing. So again, in Mrs. B's classroom, we saw the students were all doing something, whether they were on a computer, whether they were putting materials away or writings, they were all doing something that was productive. They all had a meaningful role. There's also the use of visual supports. Again, general education classrooms, high-quality general education classrooms that I've seen use quite a lot of visual supports for all students, not just specifically for kids with autism. So you'll see typically a schedule on the wall. Sometimes it's broken down into further steps. I walked into a classroom where there were specific rules around, the rules around a specific activity. So during reading, this is what you should be doing. And then there were also procedures. So if you are reading a book silently and you finish, these are the steps that you should do next. So everything was kind of visually mapped out. And then the last is that this idea of using transitional systems. So again, a well-practiced routine around the transition time, which can, without this, feel like a really chaotic time. So I've seen teachers using, kind of timers, giving warnings like we have 5 more minutes and then the timer goes off and the students transition. But the key is that at that time that the timer goes off, instead of like the students transitioning and just kind of going in their own places, everybody knows the routine. They know that at that time when they hear the bell, they're supposed to put their things away. There's some kind of system in place to tell them where they're supposed to go to next. And then this is probably the biggest piece of all of this, or one of, I guess they're all very important, but this idea of taking the classroom as a whole and really organizing it into workstations or centers. And so each of the centers has a different purpose. And again, these are from general education classrooms. This center is a writing center. There's specific materials there for students to do. Sometimes there are directions. So the idea is that a student will use a transitional system to get to the center. And when they get to the center, they don't need further direction, that they can use the visual support within the center and the structure to be able to know how to complete the tasks. The other interesting thing or cool thing about centers is that they can be individualized. So for some students that need some extra time or harder materials in a writing center, the student or the teacher can set this up. So for group B, they're going to be doing these writing materials, but for group A, they're going to be doing these. So you can start to think about personalizing or individualizing instruction within work centers. And so what all of this organization is doing is really freeing the teacher. And so what the literature has suggested is that the teacher is the most kind of valuable or precious resource in the classroom, that the teacher is the one that is actually going to help the student learn the most, right? And so if this classroom is running like this, kind of well-oiled machine, and students have practiced in and out all of the different routines, and there's enough physical structure and there's enough visual support for students to be able to do all of that productively and stay engaged without the teacher, then the teacher is free. So what should the teacher do? Maybe leave, or, I'm just kidding, don't leave. So it frees the teacher to be able to pull small groups. And again, what's really powerful is that small groups can be individualized. So the teacher can group students together based on not only their academic, but their developmental needs, and really target or tailor whatever's happening in that small group to the teacher or to the student's needs. And so here is, hopefully it will work, here is a video, it's only about 4 minutes long, of what this ISI framework looks like. Again, being the core of the ISI framework being this organization.
Listen to your new word. See if you can change pen into and pan. Good. Say Mom, listen to your vowel. Okay, ready? Only change the letter that you don't need. See if you can switch pan into at, pat. Pat. Today I want you to find 2 words that describe you. Now we're going to use it in a sentence like this. I am happy and nice. Find 2 words on the table that describe you. Use it in a sentence. I am
smart and nice.
Let's put them back on the table. Somebody else might choose those. Rachel?
I am smart and good.
Very nice. Let's put those back. Diana? Wait, use your sentence.
I am smart and glad.
Okay. And Jessica, can you slide around a little bit, your chair?
It's time to choose.
Let's hear your sentence. Very, very good. All right, boys and girls, cleaning up. Very, very quietly, standing at your station. At your station. Kiana, at your station, cleaning up papers. Ariel. Miss Johnson, a ringer. I want you to walk quietly to your seat. Our stations are over. Jessica, look at the signs. And then Sheila gets our sign.
So a couple things to point out is that the students are independently working in workstations. They're also working with the teacher. And every single one of those students is doing something different. And so the classroom, again, is so well organized that the students are doing different things, but everybody looked very actively engaged. The materials are available and well organized. All of the students had little folders. And again, if you open up those folders, the students all had something different, which is that individualization or that personalization. There was a lot of visual supports, and more importantly, or just as important, there were very well practiced routines. So we have always, when going in and thinking about this framework and working with teachers, we always said, you know, for the first 6 weeks, that's where you want to be, is just helping the students understand what the procedures are and what the rules are and what the routine is. And so just practice, 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 so that when you ring your bell, the students know exactly what to do and where to go. And then, as I said, finally, there's a lot of individualized instruction happening. The other thing that I'd like to point out in this video is that there are opportunities for the students to not only be doing different things, but different types of things. So there was one student that was on the computer. There were other students that were working together. So there's some opportunities for social interaction. There's opportunities for students to kind of take a break from the language environment if they have to. And so as I was doing this over my postdoc for the past 3 years, I was getting more and more excited with what types of things learners on the autism spectrum benefited from within a classroom, and how that aligned so well with the things that we were observing, or the characteristics in a classroom environment that were considered to be kind of optimal or high quality. And so some of those things are the classroom structure and organization. So again, thinking about a student with autism in a classroom like this, where there's a very well practiced and predictable routine, that there's transitional supports and the use of visual supports to get from one activity to the next. These it becomes kind of an ideal setting for all children, including children that have autism. The use of visual supports in a setting like this would be really easy to think about. Not only do you have whole class visual support, so you have schedules and you've got kind of routines for all the students, but you also easily could individualize what students need for visual support. So there was a little boy in kindergarten that the classroom was set up like this, and it was really easy for the teacher to take a whole class schedule and to individualize it. So that student had his own schedule during that time. It was placed on his desk. Same thing with visual rules. So there was a teacher that I was working with that was taught a gifted first grade classroom, and she had a lot of rambunctious little boys in her classroom. And so she had kind of a system placed on their desk, and she had specific rules for, try this, don't do that kind of thing for each student. So it was really easy to individualize her classroom because, again, she had this kind of system set up. And then finally, again, thinking about the teacher being kind of the most precious resource in the classroom, considering learners with autism, this could mean that learners with autism get kind of specialized teaching around social communication or emotional regulation, specific strategies. So not only can this kind of learning time with the teacher or directed teaching time with the teacher be a time for academic learning, but this could be a time that we can think about embedding some of these core deficits that we see or core challenges that we see in learners with autism. And then finally, again, thinking about workstations, having a kind of individualized workstations, or the classroom is set up in these different manners, different way. Again, thinking about students with autism in that setting, there can be the little girl in the beginning that needed some more support with motor skills. In a station, there could be something specific around that. So again, it just opens up this door to really being able to personalize instruction in the context of a general education classroom for all learners.
At the beginning, you talked about regular ed teachers and doing some baseline on the students. In the full inclusion model, have you done a specific study for students that are fully included with general ed teachers, with the paras in the class, and those wonderful types of things that you explored in the other classes?
So I'm going to try to repeat back what you just said to make sure that I've gotten it. So when you were talking about the specific kind of strategies that we were observing, were you talking about the language environment?
Right. I was talking about with the study with the attention on task, the language. Was that done, any part of that study done in a mainstream model where the students were coming in, or a full inclusion model for most of their day being led by a general teacher and supported by a classroom aide?
Yeah, so we had about 45% of the classrooms in that initial study, that initial active engagement study, were general education classrooms. So the study, again, it kind of laid a foundation for us to be able to go back in and look at what that actually means. We did have some classrooms where it was just a general education teacher with all of her students or his students. And then we had other classrooms where there may have been a child that had autism in the classroom with a paraprofessional or a teaching assistant. And then we had other classrooms that were kind of fully special education classrooms. So we did have everything, but we kind of clumped everything together, to come up with these averages. But what we saw were that, the averages they range so much that going back into those specific settings in situations is really important. Yeah, good question.
Is the CMAE available for use in schools?
So the CMA is currently a research tool. That means that we've done, kind of second by second observation of those dimensions or those components of active engagement by looking at a video. So that would be so hard to actually replicate. But what we are doing is thinking about taking those constructs of the CMA and developing tools that are more clinical. So again, in collaboration with Emily Solari, who's sitting in the back, who specializes in reading, we're thinking about how we can take something like the CMA and use it as a tool to gauge active engagement in reading activities. And then more broadly, we're thinking about what this would look like as a clinical tool. So teachers or other observers can walk into a classroom and actually use this as a checklist. So we've got some work to do to get it there, but yes, I think it's important. Great question.
Okay. My question is, how does your recommendation for the classroom structure to support kids with autism change as they age into elementary school, middle school, high school?
And very, very excellent question. I don't know. I think it opens up the door to be able to collaborate with, teachers that are secondary, thinking about past third grade. I think it's a really important area to start to look at. All of this work has primarily focused on preschool through third grade settings. But what I will say is that I've had the opportunity clinically to work with adults that have disabilities and adolescents that have autism. And these key components of active engagement, again, just wearing my clinical hat, seem to be important for these students as they go through high school and beyond. And so just over the past couple of years, I've been mentoring or coaching a 21-year-old that has autism, and we have been talking about emotional regulation and putting numbers to kind of his regulatory state, giving him strategies. Those were the same things that I was doing in a preschool classroom. The difference is that he's 21, and so things look a little different. But again, he got to the point where he would send me a text message or a video and say, like, what regulatory state do you think this individual is at? Just the other day, I got a video from him. He sent me a picture of Cruella de Vil, or not a picture, a video of Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians, and he said, I bet her number is off the charts. And so he said, this is how I'd probably be in the car too. And it's a video of Cruella de Vil driving off the road, and he's like, she is very dysregulated. So again, I think that using this terminology, before I started working with him, he didn't know what was wrong with him. He had never heard of the term emotional regulation. So again, a lot of work to be done in that area, but I do feel, at least with my clinical hat, that there is some value in these components of active engagement kind of across a larger span.
Do we know the range of active engagement on these same indicators for typically developing peers?
That is an excellent question, and that is a next step. So it is really hard to say limited. I kind of cringe each time I do it because I don't know what it would look like in a larger population of typically developing kiddos. So right, next step.
So just the comment. The video of the organization I think is really powerful for the classroom, but the other thing that's really important about that is that that's been part of what we've seen sometimes in homes as well, is so that, and for good reasons, it's like an adaptation that seems to make sense in the moment. So for example, when we would start to go work with parents, we would see that all of the toys were out. And the reason they were out is because the child had limited communication, and so you don't know what he wants to play with. Well, the problem is then there is no reason to communicate because everything is there. In addition, it's hard to have a sustained interaction because you can flit and flit from one thing to the other, and then it created opportunities for conflict with parents. And so I think the whole idea of organization, sometimes it falls apart because we want it to be, so individualized means leaving everything out so people can do what they want, and what it really does is it works in the moment, but it creates no opportunities for development and communication. So I think it's just a really powerful point from the classroom that carries over to other contexts as well.
Right, absolutely. Two things that I thought of, excellent comment, is that you're right, I've worked with families and teachers where it is like, this child has limited communication, so we want to make sure his needs are being met, so we're going to put 10 things out, and that can be across, toys, activities, or food, and in my experience, that kind of does two things. As you mentioned, it decreases the opportunities for students to be able to initiate communication, so there's less kind of interaction that needs to happen because the child has kind of free range of everything. But the other thing that I've seen in classrooms is that it can cause a lot of stress or dysregulation, because I've had students look at like a bucket of things and actually use words and say, like, there are hundreds in here, what am I supposed to do? So I think with that lack of structure in that context tells the student visually that you've got 100 things to do and then you can be done. So I think that, again, that's a really kind of simple place to start and a very powerful one.
I just had something to add on that because I previously was a resource teacher, and all the things we've been talking about, I really stress to the teachers that these are skills and strategies that they can use their whole life on a bigger scale. Taking a sheet of 25 questions and breaking it down as the teacher, you can then reiterate to the student, you can do that. You can do 5, take a break, come back. And then that could be something they use as middle school students and in college as well, like it's overwhelming, breaking down my task myself. So teaching them that independence piece.
Right, absolutely. So visually breaking down a task is something that I do currently as an adult, right? I have to break down, I have a to-do list, a running to-do list, and if I just wrote like, write a paper, then I just kind of run back and forth. I don't know where to start. So being able to break it down into, things that I can actually achieve is important. So that's all learners, right?
I was pondering why in the special ed class you found that there was more difficulty with dysregulation. And one thought I had, and you probably thought of this too on some level, is that the language, the auditory piece for autistic kids, there is a processing delay for quite a number of them. And even though auditory is a kind of structure, right, it still doesn't get processed as rapidly. So I think not for all kids with autism, but for a lot, we see it. So that may be too much stimuli. And again, a lot of them are very auditorily sensitive and get overwhelmed with too much auditory stimuli.
Right.
So hence we go to noise canceling headphones, or while they're working they have music that they've identified that they like that they can use to help. But I think that auditory system is very compromised in ways that we don't entirely understand yet.
Right.
And can be very dysregulating.
Right, great comment. So two things that I want to say in response to that is, one, I don't want that finding to kind of indicate that special education classrooms are, or horrible in any kind of way. I think it's a really interesting finding, and I think it's a finding that kind of warrants further investigation to see what's playing out. The other thing is that within the special education classrooms that we were looking at, a lot of times there was a higher teacher to student ratio, and so just again kind of the amount of language that's happening in one classroom over the next could really be influenced by the number of adults that are in one classroom versus the next. So again, I think it's important to take a look at to see what it actually means. At this point, it's just a relation that we saw between the two. Yeah.
So I think, first of all, there's a powerful illustration that you gave when you had made the point the difference between dysregulation and self-regulation that's happening in the behaviors. And I thought to myself how within schools, how those things really can be, so much, they're not understood, especially if we're looking in a general ed classroom. So how would you, as you're thinking about this, when we're looking at whether it's implementing, making the distinction between the two, implementing it maybe in a BIP or an IEP, is that a part of the process? But how can we as, educators or people or parents that are in the field help to make that distinction so that we can really support inclusion and advocate for children?
Right. Again, excellent question. And an area that for future research and clinical practice, I think is a really important area to think about. The one, I kind of always, I talk about this as like, this is my one tangent. So whenever I have an opportunity to talk to an audience, to speak with teachers, I just talk about emotional regulation. I usually get these like, so I think it starts with really thinking about educators and parents and having them become aware of what emotional regulation is, what it can look like, but more broadly thinking about behavior and the observable behaviors that individuals are doing. All individuals, not just individuals with autism, have meaning, right? And so instead of brushing that behavior aside, let's just take a look at it. And so I think that is a great place to start when we're thinking about kind of a coaching model or specific trainings. But I think we have a ways to go when we're thinking of, the specific things that students are doing. What is that list? Like maybe jumping up and down is not great, but, maybe rocking in their chair is okay.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.